I'm Kelly Kivlin. I'm the coordinator of the Artists and Artists series, and it's great that everyone came out tonight for Dream the Combine. As you know, they're going to be speaking on Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson, two artists that are very important to DIA's history. And if you haven't had a chance yet, I welcome you to take a peek next door at the exhibition, of which this Artists and Artists has been planned in conjunction with. It's an exhibition of Nancy Holt's work that focuses on her locators, her early locator works, as well as her rarely seen room-size light installations. So I'm just going to share a little bit about Dream the Combine, but first I just want to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and also Brooklyn Brewery for the beverages, and also to my amazing colleagues, Max Tadone, who is responsible for everything you see installed here. Yes, pretty amazing, as well as Andrea Avila. And yes, without further ado, so this evening, Dream the Combine will be speaking, as I said, on Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson, whose practices very much align with hers. And if you're not familiar with them, their work, both as a partnership and in and out of the studio, very much has engendered dynamic, site-specific, multi-dimensional projects, which transforms viewers into co-collaborators. And these collaborators' participation is as consequential often as the environment itself. So Dream the Combine is a collaborative practice of Jennifer Newsom and Tom Carruthers. Newsom and Carruthers received their bachelor's from Yale College and Brown University respectively, and both hold master's degrees from Yale University. Like the works featured in Holt's exhibition next door, their projects make use of devices that explore the nuances of perception, so often using mirrors and platforms that emphasize the subjective nature of how we see, embody, and navigate our environment. Longing, built in 2015 with engineering collaborator Clayton Binkley, made use of an abandoned skyway and a large mobile mirror. They used the geometric pattern of the prefabricated hallway to house a mechanically powered mirror surface, which tilted at angles, creating the dizzying illusion that the tunnel ahead was twisting itself out of shape, defying the limitations of its materiality and the very purpose of its existence. To quote the artist, "We are intrigued by forgotten places, sites of transportation, and unpredictable audiences. We consistently seek out spaces on the margins in our work." More recently, Dream the Combine won the annual MoMA PS1 Young Architects program in 2018 with a project called Hide and Seek. It also used mirrors to facilitate viewers' interpretations and intervention. The mirrors, which were tilted by the wind and the viewers' movements around them, could make visible the otherwise obscured buildings on the other side of the barrier wall, once again defying the physical limitations of the environment. However, instead of upending the perceptual order around them, the work gave viewers an opportunity to recognize and renegotiate their positions freely in relation to the courtyard and skyline, thus allowing them to stake their claims to a transformative and performative power. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Newsom and Tom Carruthers.
Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much to Courtney, Martin, and to Kelly especially. We've had lots of invigorating conversations with her over the past few weeks about Nancy Holt's work and how it intersects with our own. And I also want to say thank you especially to Max and John and Randy, who have helped to set up the space. So
we are more used to working on the margins and in illicit spaces, and so the opportunity to be here and to speak with you all and share our thoughts on primarily on Nancy Holt, but with reference to Smithson, is a kind of unexpected joy and a privilege. So thank you. So to set the stage, as it were, we're taking a cue from a line in one of Nancy's concrete poems, and if you look to your right and left, you're looking at, quotes, vision reconnected with vision in a dual channel, a kind of echo chamber of the space we're in now. And We're going to use it in the course of the presentation to show certain more axial images, but as an idea, as a sketch, but it allows us to not take this space for granted. And there's a refresh rate on the camera, so there's a neat trick that, well, not really a trick, but as the projections here on the north wall proceed, you'll see time kind of adjust as it goes through this imaginary space beside us.
Yeah, so the way this works, do you want to describe the mechanism? Basically, there's two cameras recording this space facing inward, and then they're sort of projected on the opposite screen, so you're getting this sort of pushing out of the space as you see it receding in the distance.
Metaphor is a vehicle we climb into. So now that we're all here, and in a way, metaphorically, we have climbed into this image vehicle, let's get on with it.
The journey is somehow a part of Nancy Holt's piece, that we're in a place of incredible time. We're also in a place of incredible speed.
In December, the Dia Foundation generously paid for us to go and visit sun tunnels at the time of the winter equinox. The views you're seeing are shots that we took in the car as we proceeded out to sun tunnels.
And we're kind of using the slideshow as a way to sort of remix the content as we're going along. So, recently I was talking with our son. We're also married. We have two little kids who are 4 and 8 years old. And recently I was talking with our son about the difference between gravity and mass. And he was talking about, well, the difference between mass and weight. And he's like, well, aren't they the same thing? And I said, well, no, not exactly. Mass is the amount of matter or stuff in a thing, whereas the weight is the sort of amount of kind of gravitational force on that matter. So thus the weight can kind of dilate and change depending on whether or not you're on Earth or on the Moon or on Mars. And I felt the same sort of dilation when we were traveling to sun tunnels, maybe not operating in a kind of vertical orientation, but instead operating axially, operating laterally, operating horizontally, sort of tethering us to that place. And it became this sort of pilgrimage. I mean, it takes a hell of a long time to get out there, and it requires a lot of effort. And so I think that the act of traveling to it and this duration was certainly part of the experience of the work and became part of the piece for us, this sort of dilation of time. And sometimes it felt like we were very tightly bound to that sort of object as a kind of gravitational body that was pulling us towards it with a certain amount of acceleration, and other times it was a little bit looser and more meandering.
And this invitation from Dia from us to go and visit, this is something that Jennifer and I have never done before. It's kind of a tender thing to go through an artist's archive, read much of what they've ever spoken or written, visit as many projects as one can. And she has a real sense of humor. She says, what's interesting with sun tunnels? People have to go out of their way. It's almost that she's kind of laughing a little bit, like, hey, I know what you're going through. And it's done with real intention. She knows, I'll just read a few other quotes from her. This is a society of travelers. We are the transportation society. And, I think to a degree, we didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into with her. We knew from some of the iconic photographs that primarily she has taken. I don't know that, Nancy has this idea of kind of image and non-image, and she talks about growing up in New Jersey as a wonderful place, a place that invented the highway culture, and yet a place that where you don't have to live up to any images whatsoever. There's no way you have to be, and nothing is expected of you.
So we were contrasting the sort of blurriness of this space with the very stark reality of these sort of anthropogenic landscapes, right? So, here's some sort of mining facility, and as you were driving along, you'd see these huge tailing piles and smell this kind of acrid air. So there was this real contrast between this really beautiful landscape that almost feels very sublime, and then these sort of punctuated moments where you recognize our sort of destruction of this planet too. And I think that kind of ecological perspective is something that certainly Nancy Holt talks about a lot in her practice. And I guess we're going to refer to her in the present tense. I don't know, we're just going to do that. She's very present for us right now. And I think that, in putting together this kind of conversation, I wouldn't say it's a lecture, it's more of a conversation, it was really a challenge to kind of process that. Like, I don't think that we've ever really done a deep dive into another person's work in this way. Perhaps the closest example is when I was working for David Adjaye in London, and he was working for Ursula von Rijdingsvaart in her studio here, where you really started to kind of deeply internalize how a person works and their process and what they care about. So this was, I lost my slideshow. This was a really kind of incredible and challenging thing to do for us.
I think to riff on that here. So William Gibson is an author, well-known author. I'm originally from Vancouver, Canada, and I didn't realize until I left Vancouver and came to live in the States that he was actually a neighbor of mine growing up. And so he has this quote from, he's actually talking about Steely Dan here, but artistic collaboration is a profoundly strange business. Do it right up to the hilt, as it were, and you and your partner will generate a third party, some thoroughly other, and often one capable of things neither you nor the very reasonable individual seated opposite would even begin to consider. Who, asks one of those disembodied voices in Mr. Burroughs' multi-level scrapbooks, is the third that walks among us? Jennifer and I discovered a very early parallel in Holt's work, this idea of shedding the ego, if I can egotistically say that. We created Dream the Combine with the express intention of getting something out, sort of outside of the two of us, with the idea that you can work in service of something. And forgive my halting thing here, but if architecture is a service profession, there was this early idea in 2013 that if architecture is a service profession, what are we working in service of? And it was really a surprise to see that Nancy is very aware of this in her own work, and expressly finds ways to kind of get around the ego, from her early concrete poems to her later work, this deep internalization of what is private and who the audience is. Quotes, I had to go through a whole inner transformation before I could do my work. I had to understand a lot. I had to read a lot. Being versus becoming. This was what I was interested in, breaking down the egos. I thought I was an artist in the fullest sense by doing nothing. It was like I wasn't creating anything, but yet I was creating something in order to have a void. All my work has been like that. They're all there. I gave form to the air. I got interested in how light and sight were so connected. So this process of getting to know Nancy and Smithson has been a kind of short circuit for Jennifer and I. Our third for the last 6 years has been Dream the Combine. And now since really November through now, that the third has been kind of short-circuiting and intercutting with Nancy Holt. And I think that's reflecting in some of our current work.
So obviously we're going to talk a lot about seeing, and the way Nancy's work reorders the landscape, frames it. I feel like much of her process is about discernment, about separating and isolating certain aspects of the kind of wider landscape into a more narrowed view. I think that although she's obviously documented her own work and made a series of video works and photographs, I think, she's very clear that the photographs are not the work. They're, they almost act as these kind of teasers to go and see the work. And so some of the times when we were reading about her after the fact, it felt a little bit like, we were sort of blindly seeing. We weren't quite seeing the right thing, but it was more of an instance where you actually had to be there and have the full sort of embodied experience of being at the sun tunnels. And so we're going to take you on a little bit of a journey in the beginning and talk about that trip. So this is one of Nancy's concrete poems, and I think, we really felt this sort of connection to not only a kind of broader sense of celestial time or sort of universal space, but also a real kind of like localization of place, and the way that, that it's a very, very strange landscape out there. In a way you feel like, okay, you're present in this exact place, but you're also in this sort of otherworldly landscape, where things are doubled and they become this almost like this sort of Rorschach test, and things get reflected and reframed. But, we were like the two little cowboys traveling out into this place, and really stepping into this new way of holding space. And I think what was also so intriguing to us is this kind of way that she oscillates between both a sort of planimetric understanding of the land and then an elevation-based understanding of the land. So, part of when we were kind of traveling there, and we were like, okay, well, we're close enough to the solstice, so the math should like work out. We should actually be able to see the sunrise through the tunnels, if her math is actually correct. And there was this kind of wonderful realization that, she's thinking three-dimensionally. She's always thinking in a way that kind of takes in the entirety of the environment, be it the kind of, physical aspects of the land, the psychological aspects of the place, the social aspects of the place, and she's sort of holding all of that. She's holding both the plan and the elevation and the section of the image simultaneously. You turned it off. Are you turning it back on?
I was talking about short circuits before. It turns out I'm the glitch. I have not, we have traveled, I just have not, I think getting to sun tunnels was a shocking experience for me. And it was incredibly cold. We did a kind of looping, we went there multiple times in the space of 2 days. And I just had not experienced in person a work that registered intent in multiple different scales. And I want to just be clear about that. The way that it's cited relative to the sunrise and sunsets, it really works. Like, it's dead on. There's a sensitivity to the location in section where, and you can, maybe this is something we'll revisit in coming images. We had just recently spent a lot of time working in the courtyards at PS1 and really started to know how that place operates over time. But the sense of deep time that Nancy brings and is really strongly evident at sun tunnels was a real surprise, something that registered more in the stomach initially than registered upstairs. You can see that on her 40-acre parcel, where these are located close to the middle, you can see that the horizon, the topography, these are 9-foot diameter cylinders, and the topography has a 4.5-foot low spot where this piece is sited. Like, it's really striking. I think that was the first thing that registered, even without knowing what the sunrise is going to do or when it's going to happen. That the sensitivity of the location and the siting was just that kind of control over the topography really struck me. I'd done a drawing in 2002, a series of drawings dealing with topography and section and sight lines, looking at intersections, and I just hadn't seen anybody else doing this. And so it started to feel like, here's this sibling, not a twin perhaps, but someone who like you're related to, but you never knew about. And so a lot of the work we've done has just been to know Nancy on the kind of outside world. We don't know anything about her personally, really, which is sort of an odd thing. But we will get back to that.
So I'm showing this on both axes because I think, obviously there's a particular road that goes to sun tunnels, but there's really this kind of sense of rotation and sort of open orientation to the piece. So as probably most of you know, one axis is oriented towards the sunrise and another axis is oriented to the sunset on the winter equinox, or I'm sorry, summer and winter solstices. And you feel like there's this kind of incredible movement all the time as you're there. Also, it's just like an incredibly aesthetically pleasing place. I was like, did she control like the breed of cows that were allowed to like graze on this land? These little perfect black dots in the distance were kind of incredible. There's a really hilarious video that Tom took of like a cow running through one of the circles, and he's like, a cow, really excited about it. But really, we went there a number of times, and it became this kind of dance. This this back and forth between us documenting this place, being inside of it, waiting with anticipation for the sun to rise. We got up at 3 a.m. to drive out there, to be there for the sunrise. And so it really oscillated between, feeling like you were kind of encapsulated in this form and encapsulated within this view, and then other times kind of stepping outside of that. But I think, much of her work in the locator pieces is about this kind of coming into alignment. It's almost as though we felt this sort of invisible band that's like connecting our bodies to the far distance, to this sunlight on the horizon. And so in looking back at our documentation, there were so many kind of hilarious videos of us like stomping around in the cold and trying to like dance and stay warm while we waited for the sun to kind of come up over this edge. And the way that she sited the piece where it's sort of sunken in this basin, the mountains really start to act like a kind of veil and then the sun sort of comes up from behind this kind of curtain. And it's really interesting because it almost doesn't really matter what time of day it is. Like, yeah, we were waiting for the sunrise and the sunset to do their thing and line up. But even in these moments where you're just sort of in the hazy glow of sunrise before the action has happened, you really feel this kind of activation of the site. Do you want to talk a little bit about edges?
Yeah, I think relationships and edges, everyone probably has done work where you're really proud of it. This is something that you feel it feels new, you've discovered this in a way, and you find out that somebody else has just killed it already. And sometimes it's like when you're searching for something online and you type in the search bar and it's sort of like by the force of your mind, you've created this object that you can now order off of Amazon. But here, like the deeper time here starts to have a real criticality. And I think the engagement with the relationships, with identifying relationships that come first over time was really tremendously exciting. Again, if I can quote a little bit from Nancy here, she says, "I was stunned when I went out west for the first time. It was a very special experience where I felt my inside and the outside were identical somehow. That my emphasis here is I think, important. That somehow I had been carrying this landscape within me, and suddenly there it was without. And this is where, like, inevitably I started to make these more personal inferences. Like, she talks about her family, where she says, quotes, "I never met one adult that I had any connection with, except, of course, the two, who I'm inferring are probably her parents." But nonetheless, she begins to occupy this oscillating space, the inside out, where she says, when you're in it, you're out of it at the same time. And by identifying these relationships, by embodying them with these voids, that miraculously, like by locating your eye on the horizon line, she's drawing these long-term perspectives. And this is something that maybe in 2015, after a year's exposure to works like Anna Munster's Aesthesia of Networks and a couple others that come to mind, we started thinking about nodes and links and what's between and some of the short circuits, and using that to try and problematize the production of objects. And this is like already happening here, and with a kind of a depth that goes beyond urban or sort of imaginary spaces. It goes beyond, like, she's not dealing with fixed nodes. She's incorporating time, and I think we're going to come back to that in the kind of second sort of recursive loop of this talk, where, like, when she talks about time as a way of structuring these relationships, like, is there something more meaningful about that? And I think we'll come back to that once we go and show some pictures of some of our recent work.
So, I think Tom's talking in those quotes about this kind of like thinness of an edge. I think she's very intentional. Did I just lose myself? Okay. Very intentional with the thickness of the concrete that she used, so that it's not as though this edge like disappears, right? It doesn't have a kind of thinness, but it marks a circle. It marks this kind of space in a way that you understand the relationship between the inside and the outside.
She talks about that. Like, I was really interested in the whole idea of tunnels and what they mean as agents of transition, so that when you walk through a tunnel, it's like going from light to dark to light, or it could be akin to birth or to death, and it's something that affects people.
Sometimes you have to step outside of the frame a little bit.
She talks about, when the sunlight is all around me, I only become conscious of it when it's edged by shadow, spots of warmth and cool tunnels. So we have people whose work we admire that talk about voids, and people whose work we admire that talk about shadows and the kind of positive values of dwelling in shadows. But I certainly had not been exposed to somebody that talked so feelingly, if I can call some of the dry mind that is Nancy Holt. There's something critical about her just focusing on the edge. And in some of her earlier mirrored pieces, the tracing of light in pencil on the wall, as you can see in the exhibition next door, there's something about the blurred edge quality here that feels new, in spite of the fact that some of this work, we're celebrating 50, like the sun tunnels are 50 years old. There's something about the concrete quality there as a material, and we should probably talk about Nancy's use of the term concrete, which has kind of at least 3 different registers: that of the use in poetry, that of the use as a material, and then that in the very explicit use, and you can see here behind us, as projected light. Not ambient light or radiated light or absorbed light or sort of emanating light, but projected light. But to go back to this idea of, like, quotes, using light in a very concrete way as projected light, close quotes, she talks about, I used to write concrete poems, and that would be for this particular person, and they were private, and they weren't meant for public consumption. It was working out of that, the being without ego. No one knew except the person. So then there's this tying in of working out of ego or hopefully outside of ego, which is something that I'm still trying to understand a little bit more, tied in with an idea about sort of, she's dealing with concepts of a term like concrete that have, it's both and. It's not just kind of singular symbolic understandings of something, but the meanings, there's sort of multiple meanings for particular terms. And that is something that, that kind of resonance is surprising. It's not something that's like when it occurs, it's usually a cue to kind of lean in a little bit more and listen. So I think if I remember the outline right, we're moving on to showing something of our project Longing, which I think builds upon some of this idea of embodied relationships and ideas of depth.
So, yes, we are. But before we do that, I think also going to this place, it was, I guess it's a little bit to return to the buried poems, these concrete poems, or these poems that she would, almost as though they were like these love letters both to a person and to a place, and she'd bury them in various locations, and whether, if the person found them, great, if not, so be it. The remoteness of this piece, the kind of expansiveness of the landscape, it's not, I don't think that she couches locating her works in the West in the same way that maybe she felt like other male sculptors of the time were characterizing the West as this site of, freedom and kind of abandoning the gallery structure. I do think that she sees it as a way to just be outside of herself, get outside of ego. It's almost the opposite sort of reading. And to me, there's something very intimate about that. There's something very, kind of searching about it. And I think, the fact that she's doing this piece shortly after Smithson passes away, I think is you feel that when you're there. And so we felt very fortunate to be there together, to be, kind of bathed in this light together, to have our shadows intertwined together in this place. And, it was very kind of integrating, I think, to be in this place and to feel this kind of, I don't know if love is too lofty a term or too whatever, but that there's a kind of a deep care that she had for this landscape and for this place and for the people who would come to see this thing. So, maybe that's just a little bit about that. And I think, another thing that I thought was quite funny as we were leaving sun tunnels, is that once you see sun tunnels, you kind of see them everywhere. We were like, oh gosh, it's not aging well, and the orientation doesn't seem right. But
the sighting sort of...
the sighting is a little weird. It's not really doing the whole light passing through it sort of thing. But but there's 4 of them. That must be it.
This is actually on the way to sun tunnels. I'm looking at Courtney. Courtney is not happy looking at this. Sun tunnels got really skinny.
We're like, oh, it frames that view. No, that's not quite it. All right, so enough of these works on paper that she does when she's, not quite making these huge works cited in the landscape, I think really spoke to us, because I feel like she's using language and simple text on a typewritten page in the same way that she's it's just another tool to explore this kind of framing devices and this sort of folding in of depth. And so I really love this piece detach here. Obviously, if you detach along the perforations, you're creating a void, creating this kind of negative space within the page. And for us, I think the tool that we've often used to do that is mirrors. And so I just have a little quote here that we were excited about. So Okay, take a flat plane, a surface. Take this mirror, for instance, and the two of us are on this surface, see, and we squint our eyes against the sun, and there's a blue electric spark in the tubing, and there, the shadow of an arrow just flashed by. But only on the surface, only for a second. But just imagine now that some fire has softened this impenetrable surface, and nothing skims along the top of it any longer. Everything penetrates into it, inside, into that mirror world that we peer into with such curiosity like children. And I assure you, children aren't so dumb. The plane has taken on mass, body, the world, and it's all inside the mirror, inside you, the sun, the wash from the arrow's propeller, and your trembling lips, and somebody else's too. And you understand the cold mirror reflects, throws back, while this absorbs, and the trace left by everything lasts forever. So this is a piece that Tom and I completed in 2013.
15.
Oh, 15, I'm sorry. That Kelly mentioned in the introduction. And it's a piece called Longing. And I think it, has some of the kind of maybe more yearning qualities that, Sun Tunnels has to a certain extent. But this is a fragment of the Minneapolis Skyway system. It's the only sort of piece of this system that was removed from this 8-mile network and placed on a piece of city property. Actually, a couple of architects bought it, hoping to repurpose it, I guess, as a brutalist lake house somewhere in upstate, in northern Minnesota. But they purchased it, and then it sat on this city lot for 8 years. They couldn't find anybody who wanted to, celebrate 1970s brutalism the way that they did.
Should add that it weighed 130,000 pounds with the concrete in it. They proposed turning it into a library in St. Paul, lake cabins, 3 of them. And the whole scheme was, because they got it from the city for $1, right? That sounds like a great deal. They had to pay for it to be transported, which cost them $15,000. But then they thought that they could repurpose the existing structure as a way to pay off debts from architecture school. Meanwhile, they're paying for rent on a city property, and we heard about it only just as a kind of whisper. There was one article written about it as like literal folly in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and that was it. And you go out there, and this thing is magical. And it's sitting out in the white, it's like, if you like a kind of aesthetic white, but it's Minnesota in winter.
This is what you all imagine Minnesota to look like all the time, I'm sure. Grain silos, some trains going by, white with snow.
Well, there's a relational fragment here. It's not a fragment of a node. It's not a kind of situationist fragment in a sort of Debordian sense. This is a literal urban fragment. It's the only thing that's ever been removed from the network. And there's something really exciting about it. And in the discovery and documentation, it was a 2-year process to get the scheme together, to get the proposal, get funding, permission, engineering, and anyway, I'm rambling.
Well, so what we were trying to do basically was take this kind of fragment and reconnect it to a system of its own making. So, kind of early renderings of the project were about, somehow making this sort of recursive environment out of this single instance. So what we did is we kind of replaced these end walls with 2 inward-facing mirrors, and obviously we know when you have 2 mirrors that face each other, you're going to get this kind of infinite line. Ooh, sorry, something's going. But we were really interested in what happens when that line is allowed to wander, when those mirrors are allowed to flex with each other in the wind.
There had been a show at the Queens Museum celebrating Matta Clark's Odd Lots, and I'd gone and visited Odd Lots independently, seen them these marginal illicit spaces in Queens that were just magic. Somehow but I didn't feel that it had always been a sort of bug on the brain that I felt that the show in Queens just somehow hadn't like actually directly dealt with the subject matter at hand. Like somehow the artists that had engaged with that particular incomplete work they were all sort of tangential or ellipsoid in character. And this was a way for us to think about a kind of urban void that's kind of unwanted, that's illicit, that is not celebrated, that's kind of monumental, but in the most kind of scrappy, dilapidated, potentially toxic way. And to think of it as in an animate form. Like, what if this thing was to be animate by like the movement of the prairie wind or the touch from individuals who go there?
And we wondered, what would those sort of resulting shapes be? The kind of, illusory space in the depths of the mirror. Would you kind of get these sort of toroid forms or a Klein bottle or some other sort of impossible shape? So this was the kind of side view and then axial view of the installation. So the mirrors, in effect, kind of did exactly what this sort of viewing echo chamber thing that we were constructing here did. It kind of pushed the interior space out a series of levels and created these, this kind of infinite depth in the space of the mirror. And I think, that the piece also had a kind of terror about it. I mean, these mirrors are 10 feet by 15 feet, 10 feet tall and 15 feet wide. And so it's the scale of the room. You're feeling like this kind of flexing architecture that you're within. It also had a kind of mechanistic, really sort of creaky, kind of strange sound as the mirrors rotated in the wind. This is the rear of the kind of mirror panel, and so there's a sort of center basket there that's held in stationary by a series of kind of tensile rods that are all kind of anchoring that center structure. And then the mirror panel basically acts like a gigantic sail.
So we're introducing, if you like, a kind of compression into this existing space, and the structure that holds it behind is a tensegrity structure that's all in tension. So there was a kind of legibility, just like with sun tunnels where there's this alternation of light, dark light. Here there's a kind of literal compression in terms of the two mirrors, but then an illusory expansion. And then similarly, there's this tension and compression that's in the structure that holds it up. 12 cables did it. This is Jennifer recording this in a windstorm shortly after we installed it. We were looking at winds of gusting up to 40 knots.
So there's something kind of terrifying about being here. Not only because this was just shortly after we had installed these mirrors, and so I was like, well, okay, a wind advisory. If they're going to break, I guess it's going to happen now. But also just, there's a real kind of like bodily sensation of being in this place. If you can kind of be moved by the mind, the head, and the gut, or the head, the heart, and the gut. This was definitely all about this kind of visceral experience. And you actually felt like you were sort of in this lurching, writhing machine.
I'd just like to point out that there are two little birds that lived here that are not being crushed or killed. There was no animals were harmed in the making of this piece.
We also we collaborate a lot with other artists, and so we're going to show maybe something a little bit more, slightly more narrative in structure than this talk, which is sort of, it's not, I wouldn't say it's purely just documentary, but it really starts to kind of capture some of the feelings of being there. I think that maybe we're engaging a little bit more with the kind of terror of longing, terror of loneliness, terror of yearning, maybe more so than Nancy Holt.
Although
there is something of the flaneur that needs to be acknowledged in both the wander that it takes, like the number of times we got lost trying to get to Nancy's and like overshot and had to pull back, or a road that would be clearly visible in the summertime is not visible because it's winter and everything's covered with a blanket. There's something nonetheless about the flaneur and a kind of an emotional response that occurs in the stomach as much as there's a kind of rational explanation for things.
Yeah, it's like what's going on there, but it still makes you feel off balance. So loops. Obviously, we use these kind of recursive loops in our work through the use of mirrors as a kind of image mechanism, but I think there's also the loop of time in addition to this kind of loop of space, and I think one of the things that was so kind of refreshing about digging into Nancy Holt a bit more is, she's incredibly consistent. Like, you watch a lecture from 1986, and she uses the exact same words as she uses in a lecture in 2010. And so there's a kind of persistence and consistency that I think is really kind of fascinating, and I love how she describes when she returns to her concrete poems. It's all there in these early works, and now that I have uncovered to myself the fact of actually having had a visually recorded past in continuity with the present, I will assume that the roots of my work have always been there, waiting for open moments to sprout and push up out of my inner earth. And so this quote really made us think about our own kind of beginnings to a certain extent. If she's using the kind of concrete poem as a way to explore concerns about site, geography, space, time to a certain extent.
Interiority.
Yeah, exactly. Interiority, exteriority. What are the things that are in our past that we're still mining in some way? So, Tom, you want to talk about this?
These are two works from 2000. They are castings of an abandoned highway that was never finished just outside of Providence, Rhode Island. They're 1 lane wide. They use polyester resin, which is the same resin that is used to create film negatives. But here, instead of capturing light as a negative, we're capturing form, detritus, and texture. And as a way to exercise the history of relief sculpture, this was a way to deal with both image and sight in a way where the sight creates a literal image that then can be removed, and then from a kind of plan orientation for casting is then rotated through and up into elevation.
And so still doing the same kind of almost like understanding the logos of the place, and then the sort of if we go to sort of Vitruvian, sort of
the Vitruvian definition of architecture.
Yeah, exactly. Like commodity, firmness, and delight, where the commodity is the organization, the plan, the firmness is the section, like how it's put together, and the delight is the elevation. In a lot of our kind of earlier works for both of us, through various mechanisms, through various tools, we're kind of dealing with this oscillation of plan to elevation, or concerns about taking a kind of section cut through a planar image and trying to expand that image into a kind of depth in some way.
I think that is also a core concern. Like, I can't tell you the surprise when I saw some of Nancy's kind of sketches of image sections through images. I think we have.
Well, here, just keep talking.
So this is just to say that at least on some early work before I had met Jennifer, I think I can just slow down my mouth for a moment and allow my words to speak with a little bit more intention. There's this way of that the work in Dream the Combine has been allow some of this earlier work to kind of speak again, but in service of, I think I'm so sorry, I'm like losing my words here. But there were the early concerns about surface, skin, optics that were embedded and process that were embedded in these two pieces that have informed later work such as Longing and in the hide and seek piece at PS1 last summer.
And I think for me it was this, I mean, we have all of our like old stuff on a server, so I was like trying to plug up to the server and get all these things. But I found this like really funny little concrete poem, I guess, that I had made. And it speaks to this kind of the act of discernment, of a kind of framing of, and I made this in concert with, I think, a school project that was about designing a high school, actually. And I was talking about how these sort of illicit spaces in a school and like the places where, you know, you don't want to be caught like making out with your boyfriend or something like that. But that there's this social aspect to these kind of illicit spaces, and that you're sort of moving in and out of this kind of performative space and the private zone, in and out of focus through these various juxtapositions. And this was another kind of collage from that project. Again, sort of tying, through language, tying this kind of construction of image to a more sort of social intent. But I think, you know, a piece that for me sort of speaks to some of these kind of past motivations, even though it's not in the far distant past, was a kind of sketch that Tom and I did when we were in residence at iPark in Connecticut. And this was really a kind of precursor to some of the work that we were doing at PS1 last summer. So if Longing is like a kind of singular instance of this fragment that's extending into a line, this piece, To a Constellation, was really about more of a networked arrangement. So there were 6 pairs of mirrors that were arranged in a forest clearing. And I was actually born in Connecticut, about a 30-minute drive from this place. And so it kind of provoked a whole sort of associations for me. And I wrote an email to my mom at the time, my mom and my 2 sisters, about this project. So I'll just read that. The mirrors are arranged in 6 facing pairs, creating multiple axes of reflection. As you walk through, you pass through areas where you might be caught within 2 or 3 reflections, and blind spots where you aren't in any image at all. We were concerned with active voids, or depth within the picture plane that can communicate a metaphorical relationship between what's real versus what's imagined. We wanted to illustrate the present as a fleeting moment between past and future, where each person within an image is part of a continuum of both space and time extending horizontally. It was very integrating to be in the same area as where I was born, to visit the old house and share all that with the kids. I should probably mention that our son is named after my father, who passed away when I was a teenager, and his name is Ogden. Ogden in front of trees planted by Ogden. When I was about 3 years old, my dad and I planted these pine trees, these 2 pine trees in our front yard, and now they're 45 feet tall. This piece is a direct response to that, thinking about the continuity between generations and new families that are being formed all the time, biologically, through friendship, through circumstance, etc., especially since we were in Connecticut as part of a residency program specifically for families. We were also intrigued by the fact that trees in a forest are connected underground by fungal networks. So all the trees exist as a dependent ecosystem. If you cut down the mother tree, the others will falter. So we were referencing this network of relationships below and above ground, and the kind of new friendships that we made with the other people who were in residence. The title, To a Constellation, comes from a short text that I wrote in a companion to the piece about constellations, family history, and spatial depth backwards and forwards. We chose this color because, well, it looks awesome in the forest, and we wanted to create a cast bronze sculpture, smiley face. Also, as Jill Scott says, I'm living my life like it's golden. We usually use glass mirror, but due to cost and time, we used mirrored acrylic. Since it was super hot, the material was expanding and contracting like crazy. It ended up making the reflections less planar and created these whorled patterns on the surface. They actually look kind of cool as a happy accident. Almost watery or I can't even pronounce this, but I can write it. Variegated like light passing through leaves. Tom welded all the steel frames and mounted the panels to the trees, and I did most of the metal finishing, grinding, scrubbing, cleaning, spraying, and waxing the frames, plus affixing the acrylic. It was so fun to be using our hands working together. The whole experience was super motivating and fun. Yay. These are the kinds of emails I write to my family. But I think, some of the same kind of concerns that Nancy Holt has about time, about this kind of using material, using matter, using stuff formed in certain orientations as a kind of metaphor for this movement forwards and backwards, these connections through generations, through time. It was really kind of incredible to read a little bit more about her practice and about how she speaks in a very pragmatic way, but also very kind of in a sparse, elegant way about some of these same concerns. And this sort of like acceleration through time. This is the piece that's on view at DIA right now. And I was really struck by the kind of acceleration of these, of this reflected light. That there's a kind of spiraling movement that exists in that space. That even though it's this kind of static object, and even though clearing to a constellation was this static object, they both have this kind of this movement that's sort of embedded in these forms. So there's also obviously a lot of loops. Be they generational, our son being named after my dad, or this kind of recursive space. We loved this video.
And the words are coming back on and top of me. The words are spilling out of my head and then returning into my ear. It puts a distance between the words and their apprehension or their comprehension. But now I hear my own voice, slightly delayed, coming back in on top of me, so that I am surrounded by me, and my mind surrounds me. My mind goes out into the world and then comes back inside of me.
This is the recursive self that we have been trying to understand now and develop. And something that this video brought to us is that we've had to define what the partnership is to a degree. And there's a quote that I'll read from Andrei Tarkovsky, this Russian filmmaker, where he says, personally, what I'm trying to do is set up this idea of metaphor, where you can have a kind of oscillating figure-ground relationship as a way to create a kind of echoing chamber that helps to define a practice where people don't feel limited, for lack of a better word here. He says, personally, I prefer to express myself in a metaphoric way. I insist on saying metaphoric and not symbolic. The symbol intrinsically comprises a specific meaning, an intellectual formula, while the metaphor is the image itself. It's an image that possesses the same characteristics as the world it represents. Contrary to the symbol, its meaning is undefined. We aren't able to speak about a world that is truly boundless, utilizing means which themselves are definite and restricted. We can analyze a formula, that is to say, a symbol, but a metaphor is an entity unto itself, a monomial. If one tries to describe it, it immediately falls to pieces. And I think this is a way that, by talking about these figure-ground relationships as a way that to understand a kind of recursive self, I think this is a way for us to move into discussing authorship and a kind of collaborative authorship that you see in Nancy's awareness of people and publics in her work, and really was the really underpinned our competition proposal to MoMA PS1 for the hide and seek project.
Do you want to talk about that? Well, I think it's considering authorship as more of a distributed system, and I think using kind of metaphor, using in our practice, we always say that we're just like working in service of the work. It's a way of kind of divorcing some ego to a certain extent from our process. But this sort of distributed authorship, I think Nancy, talks about that to a great deal. She really values the collaborations with well, obviously not only with Smithson earlier in her career, but also with the people who construct her work. She, I think, in a way is well, you're looking at me like, I think there's a really strong level of respect there that I think comes through in a lot of her writings and the way that she talks about the people that she works with, even as she's, kind of holding on with confidence to her role as an author in that space, but realizing that there's a kind of dance that happens, and I think that's in some ways reflective of how you and I work together, Tom. Sometimes we can't quite remember who had that idea, even as we say oh, I think that was my idea. Well, no, I really think that was my idea. And that also that authorship extends to the people who are actually using our work and experiencing it.
Nancy says, what interests me in doing public projects is that each person brings their own context with them. They bring to the work whatever they already know, so that there's that engagement. They become part of the works. And to Jennifer's point, this is from a separate interview, an almost identical sentence. What interests me in doing public projects is that people will come, and each person brings their own context with them. They bring to the work whatever they already know. When we were doing the competition process for this, we're looking at the concrete walls of PS1, and Jennifer very meaningfully said, what would it take to make people feel in place here and feel welcome here? And we were relying upon the work of Robin Bernstein and her thoughts on scriptive things, so that a book, as we know, you open it, it's got histories of movement inscribed within it. You open the book, you read left to right, top to bottom, and this interaction is built into people. It's not just built in, it's inscribed into the object. So with that, let's go through hide and seek and just talk about interaction.
Well, I think we started thinking about belonging and the kind of direct address of kind of transgressing a frame to a certain extent. And when Nancy talks about working outside, I think she's very specific about it. She's not talking just about public space, right? She's talking about working outside, being in the messiness of the outside, working outside of the gallery system, working outside of herself, pushing herself in terms of the kinds of materials and processes she's dealing with. But in the context of PS1, we were really interested in considering the outside of this kind of art historical frame, right? So what other sorts of audiences can be made to feel welcome in this space? Acknowledging that we have these kind of very strong edges in this place, right? You have these kind of concrete walls that divide this site from the outside community. And so while we can't get rid of these borders, how do we refuse the border or refute the border in some way at the same time that we're kind of constrained by the border's constant imposition? And so we use the mirror as a way to kind of break out of this, these confines in some way, and really start to try and pierce the space of PS1, start to reorder the environment. And introduce these kind of ambiguities into the space, a kind of glitchiness, right? Where you can't really tell what's real, what's sort of peeling off of the surface. But all of this was in service of, people just kind of being able to have a good time in that space. You'd get these kind of incredible crowds, sometimes from one person, and sometimes you'd see, 60 people kind of reflected and looking like this kind of huge group of people that were resting on this hammock space. But we were really excited by, these kinds of chance juxtapositions, and I think Nancy really talks about that very eloquently when she describes the use of a lot of her public works, like Dark Star Park. She says, people who go there, they don't necessarily need to know anything about art or architecture in our case, or landscape architecture for that matter, to just have a good time and understand that it's a space that's meant for them. It's a place to feel in place. And obviously we can talk kind of more at length about like the sort of conceptual underpinnings of it, but really it's about making people feel like they're considered and they're welcome. All right, that's it.
Thank you both. MoMA here. I think we're going to take questions if anybody has any. I know the room is quite warm, but yeah. I'm going to hand you the microphone so you can set the evening off, just so we can record it.
Hello. Hi. I thought Longings was really cool. I thought it was interesting, though. It seemed like in the first picture that there was glass, like the original glass from the Skyway, and it was very apparently in that context as like a moving, well, not a moving, but like a walkway for people to sort of isolate themselves from the elements, right? I was wondering if you guys had any sort of difficulty with dealing with the fact that in order to kind of create the idea that you wanted, it felt decontextualized out of that with the glass removed, there was no floor, and almost like if you were approaching this object after the finished result, you wouldn't get its original context. Do you know what I mean? Was there any issue with that, like trying to create the concept?
We didn't take those things out. The people who eventually bought the Skyway took them out. But in a way, go ahead.
It was a temporary installation. We had a window of time in Minnesota called the thaw, essentially. And so before you can move this, if you take the concrete out, the steel structure weighed something like 80,000 pounds. So the roadways needed to be dried, and so we had this 2-month window of time. And the thing was already a ruin. And as much as I love ruins, like, it didn't bother me at all whether it had mullions or glass in it or not. In some ways, it felt more, I kind of liked the way that it was stripped down.
Like it was a thing as it had become into that space.
It's an appropriated object, it's a kind of existing thing. And so for us to kind of navigate and it's a kind of work of time more than anything. And so, like, as with a ruin where it's kind of coming down in entropy, as our project is kind of coming up into being, like, there was just a kind of moment of intersection there that allowed the project to work.
Cool, thank you.
Anybody else? I saw other hands, I thought. Yeah?
You mentioned that Nancy Holt thought of the documentation as teasers rather than extensions of the work itself. And I'm wondering how you consider photography now that we're in a different landscape for how photographs are used in our culture, and especially thinking about remote works that are unlikely to be seen by a lot of people.
a mentor of ours said early in the the PS1 competition, she said, "Feed the hunger they have inside them." And so there's something that, where does the art or the architectural object live? Like, is it in the head? Like, is it in the object, of sort of what is produced there? Is it somewhere in between? I think that the images for us are more documentary. Like, they're not the piece. They really just aren't. Like, you don't get the same, like, there's kind of a narrowing that happens when you impose the frame on it, as opposed to what you get with the stereooptic vision and the different ways that you can perceive depth using your naked eye. And that's very important. Like, Nancy's really clear with her locator pieces, with controlling specifically where you fixate. And for us in our projects, we're aware that the eyes have different ways in their saccades of identifying places to focus on. First to the far depth, second of all to diagonals in the area. It kind of goes on, like alternations of light and dark will attract the eye. So I want to open it up, but I feel like for us to answer the question maybe more directly, like it's an active conversation for us right now in terms of like, what is the piece? Because sometimes there's a hell of a lot of effort and you walk away from it with a picture. You know, like Nancy builds all of her things, for even if they're temporary, as though they're permanent. You know, maybe it's a pond that gets filled in by gravel, but it can still be, like, the piece itself is still there. To date, our things, while many of them have been stored or repurposed, like, we haven't been working in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think with, obviously there were a lot of like Instagram selfie images of the work that we did at PS1. And I mean, I'm open to that. I think that, there's a way that like the work can kind of travel in other circles, but it's not the same thing as actually being there at all. Like the visceral experience of like feeling the wind on your face and then all of a sudden seeing this kind of lurching image move around you, or actually experiencing like the joy of seeing other people in those reflections and seeing, like we have another piece that's in Minneapolis that's a static piece but also uses mirrors, and how it reorders the environment, and you get these other sorts of relationships that are created by people who are experiencing it. So you'll see someone waving like into the mirror, but they're waving to somebody who's over there, but then like, part of the space is reframed over there. Instagram to us and the kind of casual documentation of our work is another sort of fragmentation of it in that way.
It does allow people to be authors, though, in a way that's exciting. And that is, I think that is a way that we're testing our own intention is, like, I don't have any kind of judgment about people with selfie sticks. In some ways, I feel like it's kind of awesome because there's, like, they're authoring something in their own way. And when you're dealing with recursive environments and interactions between people who are bringing, to take Robin Bernstein's words, like they're bringing their histories of movement to the place. So you can give certain cues for interactions to happen that are analog. But the documentation, like we certainly use images from Instagram and videos from Instagram that seem like they're really like salient and to the point.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.